Hello guys, this is Coach B with MasterChess.com, and in this video we're going to take a look at positions that involve King and Rook versus King and Pawn, and the kings are in vertical opposition. If the kings are in vertical opposition and the stronger side has the king in front of the pawn, this is an easy win. All white has to do here is move the king in front of the pawn, king to b4, and after that, even after b5, the rook will simply come and take the pawn, and the win is trivial from here. In this next position, the pawn is more advanced, but the win is also trivial just because the stronger side's king is closer to the pawn. After rook h1 covering the promotion square, the win is trivial. Black has nothing. After king to b7, white moves the king to c4, king b6, king b3, king b5, and now white takes the pawn and wins the game from here. So we're going to focus on the more challenging positions where the kings are in vertical opposition and the stronger side's king is behind the opponent's king. If the king and pawn are on the third rank on their side of the board, the rook alone can stop the enemy pawn if the pawn marches on its own, as we've seen in the first video. After rook to h5, if black marches the pawn to c5, white can simply move the king to c8. After c4, king b7. After c3, now the rook can attack the pawn since the king cannot defend it. And after c2, the rook comes behind it and wins the pawn. And coming back, if black, instead of pushing the pawn, is going to use the king to help the pawn, let's say king to c6, white is still winning here. All he has to do is wait, rook to g5, and after black marches in to support the pawn, white is going to start outflanking black. He's going to come with the king to d7, after king to b4, king to c6, pawn to c4, king to d5, pawn to c3, king to d4, king to b3, and now the rook will go behind the pawn, pawn to c2, king to d3, king to b2, and the rook takes the pawn. With the king and pawn on the fourth rank in their side of the board, white to move wins all the time, and if it's black to move, white only wins if after the rook covers the promotion square, white is able to advance with his king towards the pawn on the second move. If it's white to move, the easiest way to win is by outflanking. So in this position, what we need to do first is rook to h5 check, and now the black king has to move. So let's say king to d4, and now king to c6, outflanking the black king. We're going to advance on the other side of the pawn. After c4, king to b5, pawn to c3, king to b4, pawn to c2, rook to c5 coming behind the pawn. After king to d3, king to b3, king to d2, and the rook takes the pawn with check. Coming back, I also want to mention that after c2, rook to h1 covering the promotion square, it's also winning. After king to d3, king to b3, king to d2, king to b2, the pawn promotes and the rook takes the pawn, and it's also win. With black to move, white is still winning in this position. After black moves the pawn to c4 and the rook comes behind the pawn on c8, now the black king will move to d4, and white will be winning because he's able to move towards the pawn with the king on the second move. So now on the second move, white will move the king to c6, starting the outflanking process. After c3, white will move to b5, king to d3, king to b4, pawn to c2, king to b3, king to d2, and white takes the pawn with the rook and wins the game. And coming back from the very beginning, I also want to mention that moving the king first is not any better for black. For example, after king to d4, white can start the outflanking process right away. So king to c6, pawn to c4, king to b5, king to d3. Now the rook could come behind the pawn. c3, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3. And after c2, white again takes the pawn with the rook and wins the game. And here's another position where white is winning, even if it's black to move. Just because the rook already covers the promotion square and white will be able to advance towards the pawn with the king on the second move. So after pawn to c4, the rook could come attack the pawn on c1, and after king to d4, now the king is able to go towards the pawn on the second move. King to c6, king to d3, king to b5, king to c3, king to b4, pawn to c2, king to b3, king to d2, and now the rook takes the pawn with check. And here's our last position where white is winning even if it's black to move. Here, the rook is already behind the pawn, covering the promotion square. After c4, the rook just has to stay behind the pawn, let's say rook to c7, and now the black king has to march together with the pawn, since after c3 the rook will simply take the pawn. So after king to d4, now white is able to advance towards the pawn on the second move, so king to c6, king to d3, king to b5, pawn to c3, king to b4, pawn to c2, king to b3, king to d2, and now the rook takes the pawn with check. And now let's take a look at one or two positions where the white king cannot win with black to move, just because after covering the promotion square with the rook on his first move, he is not able to start the outflanking process, advancing the king towards the pawn on the other side on the second move. So here, after pawn to c4 and rook to h1 covering the promotion square, black here will simply march the pawn again to c3, and now white cannot start the outflanking process coming towards the pawn on the other side, just because the kings are in opposition. Here, if white attacks the pawn with rook to c1, black is able to defend it on the next move, and now king to c6, king to d3, king to b5, king to d2, and the rook has to move away, rook to h1, pawn to c2, king b4, the pawn will promote, and now the rook has to sacrifice to maintain a draw. Coming back from the beginning, I do want to mention that after pawn to c4, rook to h5 check doesn't help white either, just because after this the black king will move to d4, and even though white is going to start the outflanking process on the second move, the rook is not covering the promotion square. So after pawn to c3, king to b5, pawn to c2, the rook now has to move to h1, king to d3, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3, and now the pawn promotes and the rook will have to sacrifice and the king will take the rook, achieving a draw. And here's another position where white is not able to win with black to move, just because of the same reason that the white king will not be able to start the outflanking process on the second move after the rook covers the promotion square. So after pawn to c4, if the rook moves to c6 coming behind the pawn, black will move the king to d4, and now white cannot start the outflanking process going towards the pawn on the other side just because the rook is in the way. So after king to d6, pawn to c3, the white king again cannot go towards the pawn, the rook will have to move to c8, king to d3, king to c5, pawn to c2, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3, and now the pawn will promote and the rook will have to sacrifice. And coming back, rook to h1 is no better just because black will move the pawn to c3 and white is still not able to start the outflanking process just because black is in opposition. And after rook to c1, king to d4, king to c6, king to d3, king to b5, king to d2, the rook has to move away, pawn to c2, king to b4, and now the pawn promotes and the rook will have to sacrifice again and black achieved the draw. If the king and pawn reach the opponent's side of the board, then white can only win here if the rook is already attacking the promotion square and white has the move. So in this position, we could see that black is already on white's side of the board, and if white has the move, he is able to still win. What white has to do is move the king to c6. After this, black will push the pawn to c3, king to b5, king to d3, king to b4, pawn to c2, king to b3, king to d2, king to b2, and after black promotes, the rook will simply take the pawn and win the game from here. If it's black to move, however, in this position, black will be able to get a draw. All he has to do is move the pawn to c3. After this, the rook will have to stay behind the pawn as the white king cannot make any progress. So let's take rook to c7, king to d3, king to c5, pawn to c2, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3, and after this, black is able to promote his pawn and white has to sacrifice his rook, achieving a draw only. The only other position that white can win here is when the rook attacks the promotion square from h1. Here with white to move, white is still winning, so after king to c6, king to d3, king to b5, pawn to c3, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3, pawn to c2, king to b2, and now if black promotes, the rook will simply take the pawn and win the game from here. Coming back from the beginning, again, if it's black to move, this position is a draw. After c3, king to c6, king to d3, king to b5, pawn to c2, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3. black will be able to promote and the rook will have to sacrifice, and after black takes the rook, this is a drawn position again. So now let's take a look and see why white is not able to win even if he has the move when the king and pawn reach his side of the board. So here, if the rook goes behind the pawn with rook to c7, black will move the pawn to c3, and now the white king cannot start the outflanking process going towards the pawn on the other side just because he's being opposed by the black king. So here the rook will have to move back. After this, black will move the king to d3, king to c5, pawn to c2, king to b4, king to d2, king to b3, and now black will promote and the rook will have to sacrifice, and after the king takes the rook, this position is drawn. And coming back from the beginning, if white tries rook to h4 check, black king will move to d3, and if white is going to try the outflanking process again, let's say king to c5, pawn to c3, king to b4, c2, rook to h1 now, since the pawn can promote on the next move, king to d2, king to b3, black is still able to promote and white will have to sacrifice his rook and only achieve a draw. After rook to h4, the best try that white has is to maintain the opposition and not try to outflank black, since that's not going to work. After king to d3, white's best try is king to d5, maintaining the vertical opposition. After this, black will push the pawn to c3, rook to h3 check, king to d2, king to d4, maintaining the vertical opposition, pawn to c2, rook to h2 check, king to d1, king to d3, and now if black is not careful and he promotes to a queen here, white is going to be able to win with rook to h1 checkmate. However, black is still able to get a draw here, but he's going to have to promote to a knight instead of a queen, and he is going to promote with check. After this, the white king will have to move away. And a couple of tips for playing king and knight and king and rook. The person that it's defending, you need to make sure to try to keep the knight next to the king all the time when possible, because having the knight next to the king, it will cover the square d3 that white needs to take the vertical opposition to be able to deliver checkmate. But now the white king cannot access that square. So from here, obviously the black king cannot move to e1 as rook to h1 is checkmate, so he is going to move the knight to b3. After something like rook to f2, the knight will simply come back. If the rook will move to b2, taking control of the square b3, now the knight has no moves. He cannot move to b3, he cannot move to d3 as the white king can take it. He also can't move to the square e2 as the rook can take there as well. So here the knight has no moves, but the black king can move to e1 now. Even though the kings are in vertical opposition, rook to b1 is not checkmate and the black king could come and defend the knight, so the rook will have to move on the other side to h2, but after this the king will move to d1 and the same position repeats. So white cannot make any progress and this position will end in a draw. Later on, I'm going to make another video that it's a little bit more detailed in playing these type of positions with king and knight versus king and rook, and I'm going to give some tips for both players defending for black, and also some tricks that white can try in order to push for a win. So far in all the positions that we've looked at, we dealt with a bishop pawn, but the same rule apply for a knight pawn. So in this position, it's white to move. However, the king and pawn are already in the opponent's side of the board, and the rook is not attacking the promoting square. So this position should end up in a draw. So after rook to h4 check, king will come to c3. Outflanking here, again, it doesn't work. So our best try is to maintain the vertical opposition. So king to c5, b3, rook to h3 check, king to c2, king to c4, b2, rook to h2 check. And then here, if black moves the king to c1, white will be able to take the opposition on c3, and black will have to promote to a knight to get a draw here. However, with the knight pawn, there is a simpler method to get a draw here. So after rook to h2 check, the black king can go to b1. And after something like king to b3, the black king can simply go in the corner now. And if white takes the pawn, this is stalemate. If white tries to check the king, black will promote to a queen, and now the rook will have to sacrifice, and this is a draw. And coming back, if instead of moving the king to b3, white tries to check the king on h1, this doesn't help either. The black king will move to a2, and then after king to c3, black will promote to a queen, and the rook will have to sacrifice for the queen, and black will take it. If white tries rook to h2 check, the black king can simply move up, and now white is in a little bit of trouble because he could even lose this game now. So if you notice that you have a knight pawn, again, a better try, a little bit easier to get a draw is simply king to b1 and then running in the corner. With the rook pawn, if the king and pawn are on the third rank on their side of the board, white is always winning no matter who has the move. In this position, black is to move. If black pushes the pawn to a5, white can simply win this by blocking the king to the third rank, and we've seen this position where the pawn will advance and then the rook will attack the pawn and eventually come behind it and win it. Coming back from the beginning, if black moves the king first, king to b5, what white will do here is rook to h5 check, king to b4, king to b7, a5, king to b6, a4, rook to h4 check, king to b3, king to b5. And this process will continue all the way till the end. The pawn will push to a3, the rook will check the king, king to b2, king to b4, taking vertical opposition, pawn to a2, rook to h2 check, king to b1, and now king to b3 taking opposition. If black promotes to a queen, well, rook to h1 is checked. And here, promoting to a knight does not help. After black promotes to a knight with check, white simply has to move to c3, and now the knight has nowhere to go. If he moves to b3, the white king will take it. If he moves to c2, the rook will take it, as black cannot capture back. And if the king moves over to c1, white will simply deliver checkmate on h1. If the king and pawn are on the fourth rank or in the opponent's side of the board, black can only draw if he has the move. So here, with black to move, black can simply push the pawn to a4. After this, the rook will come to h1, covering the promotion square, king to b4, king to b6, a3, and now the white rook has to stay on the promotion square. So if he moves the rook to g1, black will push the pawn again to a2. The white king cannot make any progress as he's being opposed by the black king. So here, rook will go back to h1, king to b3, king to b5, king to b2, king to b4, and now black will promote and white will have to sacrifice the rook, and after that black will take the rook and achieve a draw. No better is trying to check the king here. After rook to h2 check, the king will simply move to c1. Rook to h1 check, the king will move back, and white has nothing better. He does have to sacrifice his rook, and a draw is all he can get. And coming back, we looked at the position moving the rook to g1, just covering the promotion square. I want to mention that it's not any better if the rook tries to check the black king on b1. After this, black will simply move to c3, king to b5, a2, and now the rook moving away, let's say rook to g1, black will simply come to b2 and then get a draw from here. King to b4, and now after promotion, the rook has to sacrifice. So in conclusion, with the king and pawn on the third rank in their side of the board, white always wins no matter whose move it is. With the king and pawn on the fourth rank on all the files except the rook files, white to move is always a win. And if it's black to move, white only wins if the rook is on h8, being able to come behind the pawn, or if the rook covers the promotion square either from c8 or from h1, covering the same promotion square on c1. And if the rook is anywhere else with black to move, this is a draw. With the king and pawn in the opponent's side of the board, white is only able to win if he has the move and if the rook is already covering the promotion square, either from behind the pawn or from in front of the pawn. And with the rook pawn, white is only able to win if he has the move or if the king and pawn are on the third rank on their side of the board. If it's black to move, this position is a draw. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and I encourage you to visit my website masterchess.com, where you will be able to practice these positions against the computer.